Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Harris Talks About History, number one. This is a series I'm going to be doing for my students where they can follow along with me as I go through the textbook that they'll be studying. In this case, we're looking at an IB textbook called Causes and Effects of 20th Century Wars. And we're going to start with World War II in the Pacific. So, the Second World War in the Pacific, Total War, Chapter 7 or Unit 7. And hopefully, what this will allow you to do, students, is uh, know some difficult words ahead of time, uh, know some terminology as you're reading the chapter yourself or studying it, taking notes, etc. You'll perhaps have an easier understanding of what you're reading as we go along. Okay, so I can share my screen, so you don't have to just look at my face. Reading, which would probably be really boring. I also have Google available if we come across something and I'm like, oh, here's what that looks like, or something like that. So here it is, the Second World War in the Pacific, Total War. We've got a timeline here. Okay, we know about Japan invading China, 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War, starting at Marco Polo Bridge. You guys all know about that. We know about, then it jumps way ahead to 1941. There are obviously other things, affecting Japan's decision between 37 and 41, but this is not moved to global war, which is our other book that we study, but this is the war. So Japan really, some Japanese historians would say it started with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, but a lot of historians date it from the attack on Pearl Harbor, which you guys all know is December 7th, 1941. The next day, the U.S. FDR gives the famous "A Day That Shall Live in Infamy" speech, uh, and the U.S. and Britain declare war on Japan. Uh, Japan has already laid out all the plans for December, and they're quickly going to take over a huge region of the Pacific. They advance on Singapore, they invade the Philippines and capture Guam, Burma, which is now Myanmar, Hong Kong. British and Hong Kong surrender by Christmas of that year, and then we're into 1942. So it takes a while for a country to, ramp up. The Pacific Ocean is very large. Let's never not underestimate that. So the shipping of men and materials from the west coast of America, California mostly, over to Hawaii and then other places. They used Australia a lot as a place to store supplies and men, and but they had to go through training. The amount of American boys, young men and boys who signed up to fight after the Pearl Harbor attack was quite a lot. But they all had to undergo, some of them got sent to Germany, some of them got sent to the Pacific Theater. Uh, and obviously there's different branches of the military. Some of them were in the Navy, on the boats. Some of them were in the Army. Some of them were in the Marines, which often go in first on the land battles. Um, and of course, some of them are in the Air Force. Okay, so we'll come back to this timeline from time to time. Some of the significant battles. 1942, there is the Battle of Midway in June. So, about 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there's a big battle on another tiny set of islands in the Pacific. And it's kind of a draw, but it's a victory for the Americans because they were able to sink many of the aircraft carriers that the Japanese had. And a lot of historians point to this as a turning point in the war in the Pacific. Like Japan was expanding. Especially if you go back to 1937, they're expanding. Pearl Harbor happens. They take over lots more territory in the next 6 months. They have a lot of military victories, but after the Battle of Midway, they're sort of on the defensive after that, and it all starts to shrink back toward the main islands of Japan. Okay. Here you see them withdrawing from Guadalcanal, one of their huge, not that's not the right word, one of the most important men in their military echelon, Admiral Yamamoto, who designed the attack on Pearl Harbor, is killed. He's in a plane and it's shot down after going to look at troops or observe what's happening down in the Pacific near Guadalcanal. So that's a huge loss to the Japanese. Then some other battles, and as you can see, it's mostly the U.S. Iwo Jima, of course, one of the famous ones now immortalized in the Clint Eastwood movie Letters from Iwo Jima, and etc. By 1945, it's really the beginning of the end. The firebombing of Tokyo is probably more devastating than the atomic bombs that are dropped later on. The Battle of Okinawa is long and very, very bloody, and they start to recapture, and then of course they test the atomic bomb, and they end up, of course, using it, as you all know, on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and on the 9th of August, 3 days later, on Nagasaki. Shortly thereafter, about a month later, Japan surrenders. Okay, so our first unit that we'll talk about in this video is 7.1, the causes of the Second World War in the Pacific. Some of our key questions: to what extent was Japanese foreign policy driven by economic and nationalistic concerns? Okay, we know that there's some economic concerns uh, as far as how are they going to keep funding uh, the expansionist aims, right? How are they going to uh, pay for the things they need to import as a small island nation? They don't have a lot of oil or rubber or steel. They need all of those things. And to what extent was it driven by nationalistic concerns? This idea that Japan is destined to be the leader in Asia. They are the maybe superior Asian people, more so than the Filipino or the Chinese or the Vietnamese, etc. To what extent could diplomacy have avoided a war in the Pacific? This is an age-old question. We'll look a lot at what was happening in 1940 and I'm sorry, in 1941 leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and to what extent were the issues in the Pacific linked to the European tensions? So how much did things happening in Europe affect things happening in the Pacific theater of war? Theater of war means an area that's involved in fighting. It doesn't have anything to do with like a cinema or where plays are performed. It just means where the battles are happening. Okay, so although Japan provided aid to the Allies during the First World War, we know a little bit about that. The country was busy expanding her markets at the expense of the Western powers, occupied as they were with the war. So during World War One, Germany, Britain, France, all these people who had colonies in China were busy fighting the World War One in Europe. So Japan's like, hey, none of these people are paying attention. They don't have the resources to properly manage their colonies, their ports. Let's take advantage of that. So, they wanted to sell things to the Allies and use their burgeoning industry, which, this is 1914, 1915 we're talking about. The country had only just started to modernize after the Meiji Restoration, but they do have a lot of industry, and they have a lot of workers they can employ. And so their imports and exports, it says here, increased by 300%, okay, during the war. Japan had expanded her influence by occupying German colonies in the Pacific and gave China the famous 21 demands. They call it here an ultimatum. Ultimatum, if you guys remember, is when you give someone a choice: do this or else, right? Uh, and they became the key importer of raw materials and exporter of manufactured goods throughout Eastern Asia. However, as the global economy began to recover and switch back to civilian production after World War I ended in 1918, Japanese manufacturers suffered from renewed competition. So now they're having to sell their goods against a lot of other companies that want to sell things now that the war has ended. Likewise, her agricultural sector, still mostly small scale, could not compete with the more efficient farming of the West and the falling commodity prices of the mid 1920s. So, Japan grows a lot of its own food, but not everything they need. And, it's a fairly highly populated country for the size of the islands. And so they need lots of food. And so there's like cheap goods coming in from outside to compete with domestically grown rice and other, vegetables. And obviously they need to import a lot of fruit, for example, that just doesn't grow in Japan. Foreshadowing U.S. policy in the 1920s and 30s, China erected tariff barriers in attempts to protect their own fledgling industrialization against the cheaper Japanese products. This would set Japan and China on a collision course. Okay, so tariffs, which is a word that's in the news a lot now with Donald Trump, are high taxes that a country will demand you pay to sell your goods in their country. So America is saying to Mexico and Canada, look, you can come and sell your goods in America, but you have to pay this high tax before you even get a chance to sell it and make a profit. China was going to do that against the Japanese. They're like, you can sell your Japanese products in China, but you have to pay, an X% tax perhaps on whatever you're going to be selling. And then it makes your profit margin go down. It makes it less feasible, or you have to raise the price of the goods to make up for the tariff. And then maybe it's not going to sell as well because the locals will buy the cheaper local option instead of your imported option. Like those of its future Axis partners, the Axis again, Germany, Italy, Japan, if we're talking World War II, the Japanese delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Versailles Conference, was to be disappointed with the eventual settlement. She claimed the right to all the German possessions in the Pacific. Japan wanted to get all the German possessions. They had small islands, they had some ports in China, but was awarded is in quotes, the League of Nations mandates to those north of the equator. So, the equator, the line that's 0 degrees, anything above that in that part of the Pacific, the Taiwan, Philippines, the Okinawa area, okay, but anything below that, they're like, nope, you don't get that. This despite a pledge from Britain to support such claims. Japan had also hoped to claim all of the extraterritorial trading concessions Germany had enjoyed in China prior to the war. So all the kind of special favors that Germany was getting from China, including extraterritoriality. Do we remember that word from like 10th grade? That is where, let's say, a sailor or somebody in the Japanese on a Japanese boat gets drunk in a Chinese bar one night and knifes a guy or even punches a guy. There's an altercation, a fight. The Japanese sailor is not allowed to be put on trial in China and put in a Chinese jail. Extraterritoriality means they get to put him back on the Japanese ship and take him back to Japan for trial, where he'll probably be treated much nicer than he would if he were put in a Chinese prison. So they wanted all those German rights, while China had argued that all such concessions should be abolished. China doesn't want that at all anymore. That's like a holdover from the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion days of say 15 years in the past. So they don't want that at all anymore. The conference gave half of these concessions to the Japanese, thereby satisfying neither side. China's not really happy. Japan's not really happy. All right, I'm not moving down as I talk here. I'm at the top of 200 now. Likewise, Japan was frustrated in her attempts to enshrine racial equality in the covenant of the League of Nations. So, first of all, we have to remember what covenant of League of Nations means. That is the document, okay, that like sets out the rules for the League of Nations. It's kind of like the League of Nations Constitution, and it's just called they call it the covenant. And when they're making up the League of Nations, which is brand new after World War One, they want a section in like their laws and rules that says, a vote by an Asian country is equal to a vote by a European country, basically saying that Asian people are equal to white people, for lack of a simpler way of saying it. But it says, demonstrating to her that as far as the Western powers were concerned, Asia was to be treated as a retainer at the imperial table rather than an equal partner. So they wouldn't do that. They said, no, we're not going to write that into our like founding document. Uh, and so you get to kind of stay out there to the side, Japan, and you're not really going to be a full member of the League of Nations. Uh, instead of an equal partner. So that made the Japanese a little bitter. Okay. Then we move on to the Washington Naval Conference. You guys all know this is the famous ratio conference, the 553 conference we've talked about many times. In an effort to avert a naval arms race between the United States, Britain, and Japan in the Pacific, the U.S. invited 9 nations. So we get the nine power treaty, we get the five power treaty. You guys can go back to your move to global war to look at those. 9 nations with Far East concerns to Washington in 1921. So we're 1921. So pretty early. Hmm. I wonder if the people flew from Japan to Washington, because back then airplane travel was still very, very new, and planes, there was no commercial transport planes back then yet. Maybe they had to take a boat. Um, like from Japan to California or Washington State, and then go across land on a train, perhaps. That's very interesting. I should look into that. The treaty signed at Washington made significant inroads in naval disarmament and limiting the future growth of navies. The US, Britain, and Japan destroyed over 60 ships between them. So there's this idea, and there's going to be another disarmament conference in Europe, and Germany goes but decides not to participate. Well, or they're invited but decide not to participate, or Hitler leaves or something. There's all this talk in the interwar years about getting rid of stockpiles of weapons and things like that because we don't want to have another war. And so this is specifically about naval boats, naval ships. Uh, the five power treaty signed in Washington established the ratio of capital ship tonnage that each of these powers could possess at 553. For every 5 boats that the US builds and 5 boats that the UK builds, Japan can only build 3. So right there, that's unequal, right? It's an unequal treaty. And reestablish the status quo in terms of naval fortifications in the Pacific for the duration of the treaty. So that's what the five power treaty did. That's the important one to remember in an essay. You could drop it in. You could see if you're talking about why, and this chapter is the long-term and short-term causes, right? Why were the Japanese upset at the Americans? Okay, one of the reasons was this treaty in 1921, where they did not get treated equally, and they could only build 3 boats for every 5 that the Americans could build. The Nine Power Treaty, also signed at Washington, guaranteed China's sovereignty. Sovereignty means there should be in control of their own land and government. Okay, hands off. No foreign power should be able to tell China what to do. While these agreements were important steps toward establishing a working peace in the Pacific, it froze the inequalities established at Versailles in place. So some of the inequalities that, they wouldn't allow the racial equality clause, now they're even more in place. 2 years later, let's say 1919 is Treaty of Versailles. This is 1921. And so it doesn't make the Japanese happy. As the influence of militarists and nationalists grew, so people that want a big military in Japan to defend themselves and to expand, and nationalists who again feel that the emperor is a divine being and we are the destined people of Asia, the Japanese. Japan increasingly bridled under these restrictions. That means they were upset and irritated by these restrictions. When Japan argued that the ratio should be equal, Britain and the US refused. And when the treaty came up for a renewal in 1936, and we're much closer to World War II at that point, Japan did not re-sign and renew the treaty. All right, the other long-term cause, so we have the First World War as a long-term cause, okay? Washington Naval Conference, and now this is the third one. This is ultra-nationalism. On the surface, Japan was a liberal democracy overseen by a divine emperor. So divine means, of course, you guys know this, that he gets his powers from God, right? He's uh, not a regular human, he's special, okay? Um, but they did have a democracy in they had a constitution, they had voting, they had a prime minister, they had two houses of the government in the Kokai, the Diet, right? But it says there was, however, no mechanism for responsible government. In reality, a number of large families, along with the Navy and Army, exercised a great deal of political and economic influence. So what they're saying is, yes, there was elections, and nominally these people that were in power were supposed to do what's best for the people, but they often did what was best for these very wealthy, large families, the Zaibatsu type families, the Mitsubishis, and those type of big families. And the Army and Navy also had a lot of influence in laws that were passed and things that were done to benefit, this factory or this region of the country. The influence was linked closely to the economic health of the country, which was in turn linked closely to an empire necessary to provide raw materials and markets for finished goods. So we've gone over the three things you get from a colony all the time. You get raw materials, they needed those. You get a market to sell your goods, and you either get sometimes you get a labor force. Other times you get what else? Oh, there's something else, and it's escaping my brain. Okay, that'll happen in these videos. Um, so they're already got their eye on expanding Japan's empire, and the people in charge are more and more want to do that. They're not, we're going to talk about Shidehara, and we talked about him a little bit in the Move to Global War book and his idea that we should cooperate with China, that China is such a huge market, it'd be foolish for us to attack them or antagonize them because why don't we just sell things to them? That's going to make Japan wealthy and prosperous. But people weren't so down with that idea back then. All right, a little quick drink here. We have kind of an interesting class discussion box that we'll obviously talk about in class here in the blue. To what extent was Japanese ultranationalism similar to fascism? So that's something I'd like you to think about. We'll definitely talk about that in class. As the Japanese economy began to falter means get worse, in the 1920s, a fundamentalist means like going back to the roots, okay, of something. A fundamentalist movement grew in importance, preaching a return to the ways of the samurai and pre-Meiji Japan. So we know Tokugawa shogunate, like 1600 to 1860, well, the 1850s, when Commodore Perry comes knocking, and then the actual Meiji Restoration starts in 1868, and that's when they take away the shogun and the ruling family and put the emperor back as the prime high leader of the country. They want to return to the ideas of Bushido and the samurai era and look backward more so than look forward, these people. Ultra-nationalism, okay, thinking that Japan is the best country. Not only are we patriotic and we love our country, but we think we're better than other countries. Remember, that's the idea of nationalism. And anti-Western sentiments were an important part of this new doctrine. And they put new in quotes there because it kind of always been there, but maybe it was more in the shadows or a little bit more understated. They didn't come out as publicly and state these ideas. But this idea of people believing that Japan is the greatest people, or their destiny is to rule Asia, those had always been there. This movement found adherents. Adherents means people that will follow it in the army, and the army was politically powerful. After the Wall Street crash of 1929 bit hard into the already frail Japanese economy, so the Great Depression has a big effect on Japan. Civilian influence in the government evaporated. Okay, so now the people that are trying to do politics for politics' sake, maybe be prime minister because they have goals of helping the country, their kind of influence goes away. Goes away. And the serving military officers who had also held important government ministries argued that expansion was the only answer to the problem of shrinking markets, and China was to be the target. So obviously they got to look to who's around. They'd annexed Korea, but Korea is a very small country at this point. So China was the natural next target, right? They're not going to maybe attack Russia. They did have a war with Russia, if you guys remember, in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, and they won. It was mostly a naval battle, but they wouldn't necessarily stand a chance if they tried it again. And China is the obvious place to go. The ultra-nationalism that was at the heart of this revival and subsequent expansion, subsequent means and the next thing, saw Japan as the natural leader in East Asia. It envisioned a periphery, kind of a circle around the main object, which would be Japan, rich in oil and other resources, serving an industrialized center, Japan, and in turn buying its finished product. So, in other words, we're going to have this empire. The four main islands, Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu, Hokkaido, are going to be in the middle. And around it, we're going to surround ourselves with colonies and people that will buy our products and give us the resources to make new products. This relationship would later find expression in the vague organization called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, in fact, a tool of imperial control. So we'll talk more about the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Got to come up with a nickname for that. That's too long to say every time. Uh, when we get to it later in the chapter. Okay, so three things. First World War and the fallout from that, the Washington Naval Conference, ultranationalism, long term. Short term causes. Okay. And this video will finish. Oh, I should have timed myself. Okay, I think we're doing okay though. All right. I've only got a couple more pages, so let's keep going. The Great Depression. Uh, what more do we need to say about it? It obviously hurt everybody. Uh, two-thirds of Japanese, by 1937, two-thirds of Japanese government expenditure spending was on armaments, on weapons and things needed for war. The radical expansion of the military had to be fed, and the lands of China appeared to be the source of a new neo-mercantilism. We've talked about this before. Don't worry too much about this or deficit financing. I don't think you need to know too much about that for our exam, but they are spending with loans, uh, meaning that the government now owes people money and has a deficit, a negative balance in their bank book, if you want to call it that. All right, Japanese expansion. So short-term causes: one, everybody's hurting from the Great Depression in the 1930s. Two, Japanese expansion. Okay, so there's no real civilian control, um, and the government began to tell in the early 1930s. So this is saying that you could tell by looking at the decisions the leaders of the country are making in the 1930s that there's not a lot of oversight by anybody not connected to the military. The alleged murder of a Japanese officer in the Chinese city of Mukden and the staged explosion of a nearby Japanese-owned rail line gave the Japanese military a pretext to occupy Manchuria. Don't need to explain that. We've gone over that a lot. The Mukden incident. The reality is that far from an act of Chinese aggression, it was an act of rogue Japanese military unit. We know about the Kuomintang Army in no, the wait, oh, now I'm getting my K's mixed up. The Kwantung Army, the Japanese branch that was in Manchuria, they staged this themselves. We all know all that, so I don't need to go over that again. And so they set up this new area. It's northern China. Let's see, just to take a break from this for a second. Let us share. Oh, I'm getting dark. Yeah, it's 5:45. So yeah, I probably should have turned on more lights. Okay, let's do Manchuria, or let's do Manchukuo, which is what the Japanese started to call this area. Here's a good one. Okay, can I make it bigger? Yeah. Okay, can I make it even bigger? No, maybe not bigger than that. Okay. But anyway, so here's Japan, Korea, Mukden, Port Arthur is the big port. Here's China, Mongolia, and of course Peking, which is now Beijing, is way up here. So it's up near the capital, and they want to take over all this. Up here is Russia. Okay, let me try for one other map if I can get one other map here that's a little bigger. Oh, that's even just bigger right there. Let's see how it looks if I click on it. Okay, it's a little bit better. So again, Korea is a part of the Japanese Empire and Manchukuo. Okay, so it's northern China, and that's important to remember when we're talking about this area. All right. So they set up a protectorate called Manchukuo under the puppet Chinese Emperor Puyi. Talked about him a lot. Don't need to go over him. The last emperor of China as a young man. I think he was in his early 20s, perhaps, when he was taken away to become the leader. But, a puppet. So doing whatever the Japanese told him to do, but he's Chinese, so it looks like a Chinese person is in charge. The Chinese, of course, complained bitterly to the League of Nations. We all know about the Lytton report. Uh, they had signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which said we weren't going to fight each other. China and Japan had both signed it, but the British are unwilling to commit any troops that far away across the world, and they sent the Lytton Commission. Even after the Lytton Commission finds that the Japanese are at fault, and that they in fact staged the Mukden incident, and that they should withdraw from China. Japan just says, no, we don't believe you or we don't agree with you, and we're going to leave. We're just going to leave the League of Nations. Okay. As a result of the report, the Lytton report, the Japanese withdrew from the League. Okay. So this is another way, if you get an essay that's about the League of Nations, this is one of the major tests that they failed, along with Abyssinia. We've talked about that many times. Collective security, the idea of the League of Nations, had failed to prevent a state, this time this being Japan, from using force to expand at the expense of a weaker neighbor. Okay, China's a big country, but they're weak militarily at that point. And that's the whole point of the league. If you're in the league, you're supposed to, they're supposed to send help. They're supposed to send a combined set of troops, with maybe 1,000 troops from Belgium, 1,000 from France, 1,000 from America. No, America never joined the league. All these European countries, and they're just not going to do that all the way over. You got to remember, during the Great Depression, okay, when they have other things going on in their own country that are more important to them to help China, right? Okay. Duh, 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 duh. Understanding the essential weakness of the League, the Japanese government went further, issuing the Amao Doctrine, declaring China to be within the Japanese sphere of influence and calling on all other countries to remove themselves from all Chinese economic and political affairs. Okay, so that's this down here. Okay, so basically, they could do what they needed to do to preserve order, it says there in the blue box, in East Asia, meaning calmness and everything's running smoothly as long as we're the ones in charge, Japan. Okay. And that all you European powers should leave. Okay. The British should leave Hong Kong. The Germans, were already gone. They wanted the French out of what was then called French Indochina, which we now call Vietnam. This was a clear rejection of both the open door policy and the U.S. Stimson Doctrine of 1932, which stated that the U.S. would not recognize any treaty that infringed on U.S. commercial rights in the region. Now, so we and I often say we and I shouldn't. The Americans should have stood up to Japan at this point and said, look, you're breaking this idea, the open door policy. We want to be able to trade with China as much as we want. If you don't stop, we're not going to sell you X, X, and X, oil, raw metal, steel, it's whatever you need from America. But of course, it was the Great Depression. So America couldn't afford to not sell things to Japan. They couldn't use that as a sanction or, uh, as a repercussion for Japan not following the Stimson Doctrine. Okay. The last part there, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and the West's inability to stop it was illustrative and set the stage for international relations for the rest of the 30s. So Japan did something they weren't supposed to do, and the West didn't do anything to stop it. Agreements and treaties were only useful insofar as countries were willing to back them up with force. Okay? You can make any promise you want, but you got to back it up when the other guy doesn't do what he's supposed to do. So Chamberlain's waving around the paper. I got Hitler to sign. He agreed not to go into Czechoslovakia in the the Sudetenland, and we know what happened later. So if the guy goes back on his word, you got to then send your troops, or threaten to at least send troops. And the West was not willing to do that in the 1930s. In the difficult economic times of the 30s, states would choose to protect trade, which is what I was just talking about. The America couldn't afford not to trade with Japan at the expense of national self-determination. It was a lesson learned by future Axis powers, but not the future Allied powers. It also illuminated, oh, sorry, I'm down here now on the next page. It also illuminated the degree to which U.S. and Japanese policy in the region was contradictory. Should each of these countries continue along its foreign policy path, it was hard to see how they would not come into conflict. Okay. Uh, I really don't want to make this huge, but I think this is, yeah. Okay. Actually, you know what? We'll stop there. We'll stop here on page 202 because I don't want these to be hugely long, and I will finish in another video. So we'll call this 7.1 part 1. And then I'll do 7.1 part 2. And 7.2, if we go down, is really tiny. So Pearl Harbor, we need to talk a little bit about it. We've talked a lot about it, but we'll talk a little bit more. And then 7.2 is the combatants part of the chapter. We've done this in other wars we've looked at. Who's fighting in this particular theater of war in the Pacific? It's mostly the Americans and the Japanese, but the British are also involved. The Australians are also involved. Uh, the Filipinos defend their home country as best they can, etc. So this is pretty small, though. Just boom, boom, and we're done. So I'll do 7.1 part 2 and 7.2 in the next video. Then we got to get into a fairly longer chapter, strategy and tactics, and that will probably be at least 2 videos as well. Okay. So thank you for watching. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know how helpful this was. And I will make part 2 tomorrow, and I'll post them at the same time on Google Classroom. And you can see how helpful they are when you begin to read these parts of your textbook. Okay, thanks for watching. See ya.